For more on the issue of immigration, let's go ahead and bring in Rafael Bernal. He's a reporter for the Hill media outlet. Rafael, welcome back to the show. If you can, explain the recently resurrected Remain in Mexico policy. What's behind Joe Biden's decision to restart it? And if you can, talk about some of the criticisms of it.
Well, thank you for having me. The top reason for Joe Biden to restart it was a court order because Joe Biden did end Remain in Mexico, and the court decided that the way in which he ended the administrative procedure in which DHS ended that Trump-era policy was improperly enacted, so they had to make a good faith effort to reenact it. Now, the Biden administration took that court order, negotiated with Mexico, because obviously Mexico has to do with receiving those migrants, and expanded the policy, expanded the nationalities of the people who could receive it, and in some other small ways tweaked the policy. And that's the biggest criticism. You know, immigration proponents, they understand that if a court orders the Biden administration to implement a policy in good faith until it finds the proper administrative way to get rid of it, well, the Biden administration doesn't have a choice. But they basically said that the Biden administration is trying too hard and negotiated with Mexico too well and expanded the policy too much.
There has been some criticism about the vagueness of the international law, if you will, on where an asylum seeker is required to request asylum, of whether it has to be the first, quote, safe country that they're in, or if they can actually request it wherever they want. If the U.S. is denying asylum seekers the right to reach the U.S. and request asylum here, is that a problem in terms of international law?
Well, yes. So the problem with international law on asylum and refugee cases is we're basically using laws that are post-war. We're really, the way persecution is defined and the way the dangers a national of one country might find a reason to leave or might be expelled from their country are defined in ways that are more accurate in the 1940s and 1930s than today. You know, and the original reason for that was economic migrants weren't viewed as somebody who could become an asylee or refugee. That's obviously changed. The dangers of you know, economic imbalance in sort of the north-south divide in the world have changed in the last 80 years. They absolutely have. So if asylum is indeed viewed as a human right, a U.S. Government blocking the right to an asylum seeker entering the country and applying for asylum might get denied, might get approved, but applying for asylum is a violation of their human rights. But there's a lot of gray area because this language is frankly really old, and nobody over the last 80 years has really made a concentrated effort to improve the language of international law and come to a new agreement, a new global agreement on asylee and refugee rights.
I remember several years ago, I can't remember if it was Felipe Calderón or Enrique Peña Nieto, the Mexican president, came to Los Angeles to address a protest about migrant rights and urged the U.S. to treat migrants coming from Mexico better. And the criticism was, well, what about how Mexico is treating Central American migrants? So how is that country treating those who head north and don't make it to the U.S.?
So Mexico did, you're right, Mexico had that claim for decades because a majority of migrants in the United States were Mexican, and there were relatively fewer Central American migrants crossing through Mexico. But there's really a whiplash out of bad policy, lack of policy, growing pains for Mexico as a receiving country, interactions with the United States. You know, this government, this Mexican government, has had to deal on immigration with first President Trump and now with President Biden, who are very different in their approach. So all that whiplash and that lack of policy focus has basically come to a very negative and declining human rights situation for Central Americans in Mexico. And let it be said, the human rights situation for Central Americans in Mexico has never been ideal. But it is declining right now because of that whiplash.
Kamala Harris, the vice president, has been tasked with dealing with this very difficult situation. She likely has presidential aspirations of her own, making that all the more challenging. They're clearly talking to Central American countries and trying to get people to stay there as part of the Biden administration's policy. How cooperative are those countries being, and is this indeed a practical goal?
It's probably practical long term, and I think most analysts agree that a smarter investment in the region is necessary over the long term. It's difficult to find who to talk to. The relationship between the United States and the governments of those countries has not yielded good results, whether it has been friendly or unfriendly. It's wielded a very corrupt system. The social and economic elites in those countries have had similar results, and really they're, for the most part, the same people who are in government. They're just sort of trading positions between, business and government. And then there is a very large sort of social network, the community groups that have grown because of the lack of institutions in those countries. And the United States has had trouble finding a way to really fund those groups and to really find leaders in those groups, although the idea is that there is less corruption and a bigger will for a democratic lifestyle. So that's a good approach. But the United States is doing what it finds easier with Harris's announcement and making private investments that the government and socioeconomic elites will not say no to, because they're important investments in their countries, and there will be some job creation out of that.
Rafael Bernal from The Hill, thank you for your insight.